Sheridan stood motionless in the doorway of her walk-in closet. Rows of elegant gowns surrounded her. Black, ivory, emerald, navy, champagne, but she wasn't looking at any of them. Her eyes were fixed on one dress, the red Valentino. Her fingers brushed softly across the fabric as Elijah's voice replayed in her mind. Wear the red dress. Not, wear something elegant. Not, wear black tie. Just, wear the red dress. Sheridan slowly lifted the gown from its hanger, her brow furrowing as the realization settled over her. How did he remember? She had never told him she owned it, never worn it around him, never even mentioned it. For 12 years, she'd convinced herself she was the only one paying attention. Now, for the first time, Sheridan wondered if she'd been wrong all along. If Elijah King remembered the red dress, what else had he remembered about her? This is episode 2 of The Line We Cross. The Metropolitan Club looked like old money pretending not to show off. Gold lights spilled from massive chandeliers overhead, reflecting against marble floors polished so perfectly Sheridan could see distorted flashes of red silk beneath her heels as she crossed the ballroom. Conversations drifted around her in soft waves. Politicians, investors, socialites, executives. Atlanta's most powerful people gathered beneath one roof pretending their fortunes weren't built on leverage and appetite. Sheridan fit in beautifully, which was exactly why she felt dangerous tonight. The Valentino Elijah requested clung to her like liquid red fire. Elegant from the front, catastrophic from the back. The deep line exposing her spine made cool air kiss against her skin every time she moved through the ballroom. She'd told herself wearing it was strategic, a calculated distraction. Not because Elijah remembered it. Definitely not because Elijah remembered it. Sheridan lifted her champagne flute to her lips just as Kingsley's CFO stepped beside her. Jonathan Reed smelled like expensive scotch and insecurity. "Ms. Montgomery," he said smoothly, though his eyes lingered too long along the open back of her dress. "I hear you've been causing problems for my logistics department." Sheridan smiled politely without softening. "Then your logistics department should probably improve." His laugh came too quickly. Nervous. Interesting. Jonathan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Rerouting Savannah contracts was aggressive." Sheridan swirled her champagne once before answering. "Aggressive implies it wasn't justified." Across the ballroom, Elijah appeared in her line of sight near a towering arrangement of black calla lilies. Of course, even here. He stood half-shadowed beneath the ballroom lighting, tuxedo impossibly sharp, one hand resting near a lowball glass he hadn't touched in several minutes. Watching, not casually, watching her. Sheridan felt it instantly. Jonathan followed her line of sight and went subtly pale. "Also interesting. You and King seem..." Jonathan searched carefully for a safe word. "Aligned." Sheridan almost smiled. Before she could answer, warmth settled near the exposed line of her back. "Elijah." He stopped just behind her shoulder, close enough for sandalwood and bourbon to cut through the ballroom air. "Jonathan," Elijah said smoothly. The CFO straightened immediately. "King." Elijah's hand hovered near Sheridan's waist. Not possessive exactly, but close enough to communicate something unmistakable. Power recognized power. "You enjoying the gala?" Elijah asked. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Very much." "Good." Elijah's gaze never left him. "Because tomorrow's board meeting may be less pleasant." The CFO's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "There it is. Fear." Sheridan watched Elijah work with reluctant admiration. He didn't dominate rooms loudly. He simply removed oxygen until everyone else adjusted around him. Jonathan muttered something about greeting another investor and disappeared into the crowd almost immediately. Elijah waited until he was gone before finally looking at Sheridan fully. And there it was again. That look. Like the dress had personally offended his self-control. "You're enjoying this too much," he said quietly. Sheridan sipped her champagne slowly. "Watching CFO's sweat?" "A little." His eyes dropped briefly to the curve of her bare back before returning to her face. "That's not what I meant." Heat climbed her spine immediately. Annoying. Around them, the orchestra shifted into a slower arrangement, while conversations blurred into elegant background noise. Elijah gestured subtly toward a quieter alcove near the terrace doors. "Walk with me." Not a request. Sheridan followed anyway. The alcove sat partially hidden behind enormous ferns and velvet drapery, dimmer than the ballroom proper. The sounds of the gala softened there, distant enough to feel private without actually being private. Dangerous balance. The second they stopped moving, Elijah turned toward her. "Too close. Always too close." "You baited him," he said. Sheridan tilted her head innocently. "Jonathan, elaborate innocence doesn't suit you, Sheridan." That nearly made her laugh. She crossed one leg slowly in front of the other, the slit of her dress shifting deliberately. "You sent me into a room full of wealthy men wearing red silk and then expected subtlety?" Elijah's jaw tightened once. Tiny reaction. Huge satisfaction. "You're distracting people from the strategy." Sheridan stepped closer. "People?" she asked softly. "Or you?" The silence after that felt alive. Elijah looked down at her like he was actively deciding whether restraint remained a good idea. "That's dangerous territory," he said finally. "So is corporate espionage. You hacked shipping manifests. You emotionally terrorized a CFO." A pause. Then Elijah's mouth twitched. God, that almost smile was becoming a problem. Sheridan reached up and adjusted his lapel lightly, fingers smoothing fabric that didn't actually need fixing. The move looked intimate from a distance. She knew because Elijah's breathing changed immediately. "You're staring again," she murmured. His hand closed gently around her wrist before she could step away. Not rough. Worse. Careful. Sheridan's pulse kicked hard beneath his thumb. "Elijah, you know what the problem is?" he interrupted quietly. She looked up. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. "I spent years telling myself you were off limits." Sheridan's breath caught slightly. Malcolm. There it was again. The line neither of them had crossed. Until now. "And?" she asked softly. Elijah's expression shifted then. Not polished CEO, not controlled strategist. Just a man losing an argument with himself in real time. "You changed," he admitted. Sheridan frowned slightly. "I'm wearing a dress. Not undergoing a spiritual transformation." A low laugh escaped him despite himself. Then his thumb brushed once across the inside of her wrist. Tiny movement. Devastating effect. "No," Elijah said quietly. "You stopped looking at me like Malcolm's friend." He held her gaze fully now. "And I stopped pretending I didn't notice." The honesty of it hit harder than flirting ever could. Sheridan suddenly understood something dangerous. Elijah wasn't reckless by nature, which meant every step toward her had been deliberate. The CFO disappeared back into the ballroom looking vaguely ill. "Good." Sheridan leaned against the balcony railing, letting the cool Atlanta wind calm, the heat still lingering beneath her skin. Behind her, the gala pulsed with music and expensive laughter. But out here everything felt quieter, more honest. Elijah stepped onto the balcony a moment later carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. No audience now. No strategy performance. Just the 2 of them and a skyline full of bad decisions waiting to happen. Sheridan accepted the glass carefully, though her fingers brushed his in the exchange. Still electric. Still a problem. The city glittered below them in gold and white while the wind lifted loose strands of hair from Sheridan's neck. Elijah loosened his bow tie slightly, finally looking less like Atlanta's most untouchable CEO and more like a man stretched thin by restraint. "You've been avoiding me since the comptroller conversation," he said quietly. Sheridan took a slow sip of bourbon before answering. "I wasn't aware we'd become emotionally transparent with each other." His mouth twitched faintly. "We haven't," he said. "Yet." That word settled heavily between them. Yet. Sheridan looked out over the skyline instead of directly at him. "You told me to pressure Kingsley. I pressured Kingsley. You quoted my Yale thesis at the comptroller." That finally pulled her gaze back toward him. Elijah leaned one shoulder against the railing, studying her with unsettling focus. Word for word, he added. Sheridan's stomach tightened. Because she had. And because there was absolutely no professional explanation for why she'd memorized a decade-old thesis written by Elijah King during graduate school. Lucky guess, she said lightly. Sheridan. Just her name. Low. Knowing. Dangerous. The bourbon burned warmer going down this time. You really want honesty tonight? She asked quietly. Elijah didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer almost undid her. The wind pressed silk against her legs while the city lights painted Elijah in shifting gold and shadow. Up close, she could see the exhaustion he hid from everyone else. The strain around his eyes, the tension constantly sitting in his shoulders. And suddenly she understood something she hadn't before. Elijah wasn't distant because he felt nothing. He was distant because he felt too much and trusted himself too little with it. That paper mattered to me, Sheridan admitted finally. Elijah went completely still. When I was younger, she continued carefully, everyone treated you like you were inevitable. Malcolm, investors, professors. She looked down into her glass briefly. But that thesis was the first time I understood how your mind worked. His jaw tightened slightly. You kept it. Not a question. Sheridan laughed softly under her breath. Buried under financial reports where nobody could accuse me of being pathetic. That earned a real laugh from him. Quiet. Rough around the edges. Human. God, she liked that sound too much. Elijah stepped closer then. Not enough to trap her, just enough to shift the air between them again. How long? He asked. Sheridan frowned slightly. How long what? How long have you looked at me like this? The honesty of the question stole her prepared defenses instantly. She could have lied. Should have lied. Instead, since I was 18, the admission disappeared into the night between them. Elijah exhaled slowly through his nose, eyes closing briefly like the answer physically hit him. Jesus! Sheridan tried to laugh it off. Relax. I survived it. His gaze snapped back to hers immediately. That's not funny. No teasing now. No flirtation. Just raw honesty. And somehow that made the atmosphere infinitely more intimate. Sheridan tightened her fingers around the bourbon glass. You were Malcolm's best friend. Older. Untouchable. She shrugged lightly. I figured eventually I'd grow out of it. You didn't. The certainty in his voice made her pulse jump. No, she admitted softly. Apparently not. Elijah looked at her then like he was reevaluating the last decade of his life in real time. The wind lifted her dress again. Red silk rippling against her skin while the city hummed below them. You think distance was easy? He asked quietly. Sheridan blinked. That, she hadn't expected. Elijah laughed once under his breath. But there was no humor in it. You graduated and suddenly started showing up to Malcolm's cookouts looking like corporate warfare in heels. His gaze drifted briefly down the line of her dress before returning to her eyes. You stopped being a kid. Heat climbed Sheridan's throat immediately. And you noticed. Every time. The confession landed like a match dropped into gasoline. Neither of them moved after that. They didn't need to. The tension between them had become its own living thing. Sheridan stepped closer first. Not strategically. Not intelligently. Honestly. Elijah's hand settled carefully against her waist like he was still giving himself one final chance to stop. He didn't stop. Neither did she. The skyline blurred behind him as Sheridan reached for his bow tie, loosening it slowly beneath trembling fingers. Elijah watched her the entire time with the kind of restraint that looked physically painful. You're shaking, she whispered. A rough breath escaped him. You should probably be concerned about that. Sheridan smiled faintly. I'm considering it. His forehead rested briefly against hers then, and the contact felt dangerously intimate after years of almosts and restraint. Tell me to stop, Elijah said quietly, not commanding, requesting. That mattered more than she expected. Sheridan closed her eyes for one brief second, because part of her wanted to say no. Part of her wanted to stop thinking entirely. And another part, the smarter part, knew crossing this line would change everything. Malcolm, work, Kingsley, all of it. When she opened her eyes again, Elijah was still waiting, still giving her the choice. Not tonight, she whispered. Pain flickered across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Then control returned immediately. CO mask, discipline, containment. Elijah stepped back slowly, adjusting his loosened bow tie with steady hands despite the tension still visible beneath his composure. Kingsley first, he said roughly. Sheridan nodded once, though disappointment curled unexpectedly in her chest. The balcony doors opened behind them then, spilling warm ballroom light across the stone. Voices drifted closer, reality returning. Before Sheridan could step away fully, Elijah caught her wrist one last time and pressed something cold into her palm. A penthouse keycard. His gaze held hers steadily. Elijah slipped the black keycard into Sheridan's hand, his fingers lingering around hers for just a moment. His voice was barely above a whisper. After this, his thumb slowly brushed across her knuckles. We don't pretend anymore. Sheridan looked down at the keycard, then back into his eyes. For the first time in 12 years, neither of them was hiding. The city lights shimmered behind them, Atlanta stretching into the distance beneath the terrace as they stood together in the quiet, unaware that everything had just changed. Several minutes earlier, the terrace had been almost empty. Music drifted softly through the open ballroom doors, while warm summer air carried the sounds of the city below. Elijah stood impossibly close, one hand resting gently at Sheridan's waist. Her fingers curled into the front of his tuxedo. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them noticed the world around them. They only saw each other. A loose strand of hair lifted in the evening breeze as Elijah reached up, brushing it gently behind her ear. His forehead drifted toward hers. One heartbeat, one breath, one impossible moment. Then, flash, muted, barely noticeable against the glittering skyline beyond the terrace. Neither of them looked up. Neither of them even realized it had happened. Hidden just inside the partially open terrace doors, a photographer slowly lowered the camera from his eye. The image glowed across the back of the display. He studied it for a long moment, Elijah King's hand resting protectively at Sheridan's waist. Sheridan looking up at him with a softness no boardroom had ever witnessed. Two people completely unaware they had just become tomorrow's story. The photographer smiled to himself. He slipped an extra memory card into his jacket pocket before quietly closing the camera bag. Tomorrow morning, he said with a quiet chuckle, this city is going to lose its mind. Without another word, he disappeared into the crowd. Back on the terrace, Elijah gently placed the black keycard into Sheridan's hand. After this, he whispered once more, we don't pretend anymore. Sheridan smiled, completely unaware that someone else had already made sure they never could again. One flash, one photograph, one stolen moment. That was all it took. For 12 years, Elijah King and Sheridan Montgomery had hidden behind timing, loyalty, and the lines they refused to cross. Tonight, those lines disappeared, but neither of them knows that someone else was watching. And by morning, Atlanta will know their secret. Will one photograph destroy everything they've built? Or will it finally force them to stop pretending? Find out in episode 3 of The Line We Cross. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Question of the day. If you were Sheridan, would you risk your career and your relationship with your brother for a chance at the love of your life? I'll see you in episode 3.